Hey everyone, what's up? Today I'm going to be teaching you about food chains and food webs and how the flow of energy works within them. Now, before I start talking about food chains, food webs, and how the flow of energy works, we need to address three things: what exactly energy is, how we obtain energy, and where energy comes from. Well, energy in simple terms is the ability to do work, so things like jogging and working out require energy. Even simple things such as typing or even eating require energy. And to get energy, we need to eat other organisms such as plants and animals. Organisms who eat other organisms are consumers, but are also known as heterotrophs. Some examples of heterotrophs could be a rabbit eating grass or a snake eating a rabbit. There are also organisms who can create their own energy by using inorganic substances and are known as producers, but can also be referred to as autotrophs. For example, plants can make their own energy through a process known as photosynthesis, where they take water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide to create glucose. And because plants create their own energy instead of eating other organisms to gain energy, all life depends on plants. Alright, now that we've covered what energy is, how it's obtained, and where it comes from, we can now move on to how energy flows between each organism. As mentioned before, there are organisms who are either autotrophs or heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are typically animals, and as we know, there are carnivores, omnivores, and herbivores. There are typically three levels of consumers. There are primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Primary consumers are herbivores, whereas secondary and tertiary consumers are either carnivores or omnivores. While there are three levels of consumers, there is only one level of producers. These four levels are called trophic levels. The flow of energy goes from primary producers being eaten by primary consumers being eaten by secondary consumers, and secondary consumers being eaten by tertiary consumers. This flow of energy is represented as a pyramid because as the flow of energy goes up along the trophic levels, there is less energy being transferred. There's less energy transferred the further up the pyramid because the general transfer of energy is inefficient. This energy inefficiency is also known as the 10% rule. The 10% rule is when only 10% of the energy is actually being transferred, whereas the other 90% is either used or lost. Basically, only about 10% of energy gets passed onto the next trophic level. As this 10% energy transfer goes up along the pyramid, the energy being transferred compared to the original overall energy gets staggeringly low. Starting from primary producers, it starts from 100%, and as you go up the pyramid, it decreases to 10%, 1%, and lastly a staggering 0.1% of energy received. This flow of energy explains why there are more herbivores than there are carnivores. This can be shown through food chains and food webs. A food chain is a linear hierarchy where an organism depends on the next as a source of food. For example, grass is eaten by a rabbit, the rabbit gets eaten by a snake, and the snake gets eaten by an eagle. A food web is much more complex than a food chain. A food web typically represents multiple food chains that can occur within an ecosystem, and is an overall much more accurate representation of how energy flows within an ecosystem. One more important factor that helps the flow of energy are decomposers and detritivores. Decomposers and detritivores consume dead plants and animals. Decomposers are typically bacteria or fungi, whereas detritivores are animals. Decomposers and detritivores are important to keep the flow of energy going. To recap, energy is the ability to do work, and we gain energy by consuming other organisms such as plants or animals. Organisms who eat other organisms are consumers, and plants are producers. Because plants produce their own energy, all life depends on plants. There are different levels of consumers and producers, which are called trophic levels. The flow of energy is represented as a pyramid because as the flow of energy goes up the pyramid, the less energy is transferred. This transfer of energy follows the 10% rule, where only 10% of the energy is transferred to the next trophic level, and the other 90% is either used or lost. This flow of energy is better represented in a food chain or food web. A food chain is a linear hierarchy where an organism depends on the next as a food source. A food web is much more complex and contains multiple food chains. Decomposers and detritivores help keep the flow of energy going by consuming dead plants and animals.